Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of his ship, looking out at the strange red planet below. The U-East Meridian had been traveling for 3 months to reach this place. Earth scientists had picked up weird energy signals coming from here, and they wanted to know what was causing them. "Captain, we're getting some really odd readings," said Lisa Turner, his science officer. She was staring at her computer screen with a worried look. "The energy patterns don't match anything we've seen before." Jake walked over to look at her screen. The numbers and graphs meant nothing to him, but Lisa was the smartest person he knew when it came to this stuff. If she was worried, then he should be too. "What kind of readings?" he asked. "It's like the planet is humming with power," Lisa said. "But it's not coming from the surface. It's coming from deep underground." Ben Carter, the ship's security chief, looked up from his station. "Could be dangerous, Captain. Maybe we should report back to Earth first." Jake thought about it. They had come a long way to get here. Earth was expecting answers, not more questions. "We'll be careful," he said, "but we need to take a look." Maria Santos, who handled all their communications, was listening to radio signals from space. "Captain, I'm not picking up any signs of life down there. No radio signals, no heat signatures. Nothing." That was strange. The planet looked like it could support life. It had water, air, and the right temperature. But Maria was right. Her equipment showed the planet was empty. "All right," Jake decided. "We'll send down a small team. Lisa, I want you to check out these energy readings. Ben, you're with us for security. Maria, you stay here and keep the ship ready." 2 hours later, Jake, Lisa, and Ben were walking across the red desert of the planet. The air was thin but breathable. The ground was covered with strange rocks that seemed to shimmer in the light. In the distance, they could see what looked like old buildings. "Those structures are definitely not natural," Lisa said, looking through her binoculars. "Someone built them a long time ago." As they got closer, Jake could see that the buildings were huge. They were made of some kind of black stone that seemed to absorb light. Strange symbols were carved all over the walls. "Look at this," Ben said, pointing at one of the symbols. "It's like a warning sign." Dr. Ryan Phillips, their expert on old alien cultures, would have loved to see this. But he was back on Earth, so Lisa had to do her best to figure out what the symbols meant. "These markings are old," she said, running her hand over the carved stone. "Really old. Thousands of years, maybe more." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. Something about this place felt wrong. The air was too quiet, and the buildings looked like they were made for things much bigger than humans. They found an entrance to what looked like the main building. The door was already open, as if someone had left in a hurry. Inside, the walls were covered with more symbols. But these were different. They looked like they were trying to tell a story. "I think I can make out some of this," Lisa said, studying. "The wall. It's about something called the WorseHFY. They were locked away because they were too dangerous." "Locked away where?" Jake asked. Lisa pointed to a section of the wall where the symbols were darker and seemed to move when you looked at them. I think they were locked away in another dimension. Somewhere that's not part of our normal reality." Ben was looking at something else. In the center of the room was a large machine. It was made of the same black stone as the buildings, but it had metal parts that gleamed like they were new. "Captain, this thing is still running," Ben said. "Look at these lights." Jake looked at the machine. Sure enough, there were small lights blinking on and off. Energy was flowing through it, even after all these years. "What do you think it does?" Jake asked. Lisa was studying her readings again. "I think it's a lock," she said slowly. "A lock. That keeps something trapped in another dimension." "The WorseHFY," Jake said. "Maybe," Lisa agreed. "But look at this." She showed him her scanner. The energy levels are dropping. Whatever this machine is doing, it's getting weaker. Jake felt that chill again, stronger this time. How much weaker? At this rate, it'll stop working completely in a few days. Ben was examining the machine more closely. Captain, I think someone has been messing with this thing. See these scratches on the metal? They're fresh. Jake looked where Ben was pointing. He was right. Someone had been working on the machine recently. But who? Maria had said there was. No life on the planet. We need to get out of here, Jake said. Now. But as they turned to leave, Lisa's scanner started making a loud beeping sound. The energy readings were spiking. Something's happening, Lisa said. The machine is powering up. The lights on the machine started blinking faster. The symbols on the walls began to glow with a red light. And from somewhere deep in the building, they could hear a sound like screaming. Run, Jake said. They ran through the building and out into the desert. Behind them, the building was glowing brighter and brighter. The ground was shaking, and the air itself seemed to be changing. Get to the ship, Jake shouted into his radio. Maria, start the engines. We're leaving now. But as they ran toward their landing site, Jake saw something that made his blood freeze. The sky was turning dark, not with clouds, but with something else. Something that moved and twisted like it was a live dot, and in that darkness, he could see shapes. Huge, impossible. Shapes that hurt to look at. The Vorthik were free. Jake grabbed his radio. This is Captain Narration to Earth Command. We have a situation. We've unleashed something that should have stayed buried. God help us all. The transmission sent, but Jake wondered if anyone would be left to receive it. The things in the sky were getting bigger, and the planet around them was starting to change. The rocks were melting and reshaping themselves into horrible new forms. Whatever the Vorthik were, they were loose now. And Jake had the terrible feeling that Earth had no idea what was coming. Admiral Kate Robinson was drinking her morning coffee when the emergency alarm started screaming. She had been running Earth's Colonial Defense Command for 15 years, and she had never heard the alarm sound quite like that. It was the code for something they had never faced before. She ran to the command center, where her staff was already working. General Paul Henderson was standing at the main display, his face pale. "What's the situation?" Kate asked. "We lost contact with the Meridian 12 hours ago," Paul said. "Their last message was ... strange." Kate listened to Captain Morrison's transmission. The words made no sense. What did he mean by unleashed something? What could be so bad that a tough captain like Morrison would sound so scared? "Have we tried to contact them again?" Kate asked. "Every hour," said Lieutenant Commander Steve Watson, who was running communications. "Nothing. The whole system has gone quiet." Kate looked at the star map. The Kepler 442 system was far from Earth, but not far from 3 human colonies. If something bad was happening there, those colonies could be in danger. "Send messages to all ships in that area," Kate ordered. "I want to know what's going on." But over the next few days, the news got worse. The first ship to reach the Kepler system found something impossible. The planet where Morrison had landed was no longer red. It was black, and it seemed to be moving. "The surface is changing," reported Captain Danny Clark from the scout ship UES Falcon. "It's like the whole planet is alive. The rocks are growing into shapes that don't make sense. And there's something else. The space around the planet feels wrong. Our instruments are going crazy." Kate ordered Captain Clark to keep his distance and report everything he saw. What he told them over the next few hours made everyone in the command center sick with fear. The planet was growing, not just getting bigger, but spreading its wrongness into space. Ships that got too close started to change. Their metal hulls would begin to twist and grow strange bumps. The air inside would become thick and hard to breathe, and the crew would start to hear voices that weren't there. "Get all ships away from that system," Kate ordered. "Right now." But it was already too late for some of them. The U's Pioneer had gone too close, trying to help any survivors. Their last message was just screaming. Dr. Ellen Hayes, Earth's best expert on alien life, was brought in to study what little information they had. She spent 3 days looking at the data before she came to see Kate. "Admiral, I don't think these Vorthic things are like any aliens we've ever met," Ellen said. "They don't just live in our universe. They exist in the spaces between realities. They can change the basic rules of how things work." "What does that mean?" Kate asked. "It means they don't follow the laws of physics like we do. They can make matter do impossible things. They can turn a rock into something that thinks and feels pain. They can make space itself sick." Kate felt cold. "How do we fight something like that?" Ellen shook her head. "I don't know if we can. Every planet they touch becomes part of them. They don't just conquer worlds. They make worlds into extensions of themselves." The bad news kept coming. The colony on New Terra sent a message saying strange things were appearing in their sky, dark shapes that moved against the stars. Then they went silent. Steve Watson was trying to contact every human settlement in the outer systems. Most of them were not answering. The few that did answer had terrible stories to tell. "The colonists on Bright Hope said the ground started to bleed," Steve reported. "Not red blood, but something black that moved on its own. Anyone who touched it started to change. They're evacuating now." Kate looked at the star map. Red dots showed where they had lost contact with human settlements. There were already too many red dots, and more were appearing every day. Professor Amy Collins arrived from the university with a team of scientists. She had been studying the old records of other spacefaring races, looking for any mention of the Vorthic. "I found something," Amy said. "There are stories from at least 6 different alien races about creatures that sound like the Vorthic. They all describe the same thing: beings from outside normal reality who corrupt everything they touch." "What happened to those alien races?" Kate asked. Amy's face was grim. "They're all extinct, every single one. The records suggest they all died fighting the Vorthic." Kate felt like the walls were closing in. If 6 advanced alien races couldn't stop these things, what chance did humanity have? The answer came faster than anyone expected. Reports started coming in from the inner colonies. The darkness was spreading faster now. Whole systems were going silent in a matter of hours instead of days. Lieutenant Commander Watson was coordinating the evacuation of civilian populations. Thousands of ships were trying to flee toward Earth, carrying families and children away from the spreading corruption. "We're running out of places to run to," Steve told Kate privately. "The Vorthic aren't just spreading randomly. They're moving toward Earth. It's like they know where we came from." Kate stood in her office, looking out at the stars. Somewhere out there, an enemy beyond human understanding was coming for them. Every weapon they had, every ship, every soldier, would be useless against beings that could rewrite reality itself. General Henderson came to see her that evening. He looked like he had aged 10 years in the past week. "Admiral, we need to consider extreme options," Paul said. "There are projects, classified projects, that might give us a chance." "What kind of projects?" Kate asked. Paul hesitated. "The kind we swore we would never use. The kind that might save humanity, but at a cost we can't imagine." Kate thought about all the red dots on the star map, all the colonies that had gone silent, all the families fleeing toward Earth with nowhere else to run. "Tell me about these projects," she said. As Paul began to explain, Kate realized that humanity was about to cross a line they could never come back from. But with the vortex spreading across the galaxy like a disease, they might not have any choice. Outside her window, the stars looked smaller and more fragile than they ever had before. And somewhere in that darkness, something was coming for Earth. Dr. Charles Blake walked through the underground halls of the most secret facility on Earth, the Project. Pandora Labs were buried 3 miles beneath the surface, hidden from everyone except a few dozen people who had clearance to know they existed. Charles had been working on Project Pandora for 20 years. It was the kind of work that kept him awake at night, wondering if what they were doing was right. But now, with the vortex spreading across human space like a plague, he knew their work might be humanity's only hope. Admiral Robinson had called him to a meeting that morning. She wanted to know if Project Pandora had anything that could fight the alien threat. Charles had told her the truth. They had something, but it was not what anyone would call normal. The elevator took him down to level 7, the deepest part of the facility. Here, behind walls of steel and energy shields, they kept the results of their work. The artificial beings they had created were not robots or computers. They were something much stranger and more dangerous. "Good morning, Alex," Charles said, as he entered the main containment room. The being that looked back at him appeared to be a young man in his 20s. He had dark hair and brown eyes, and he could have been anyone's son or brother. But Charles knew better. Alex was not human, even though he had started with human thoughts and memories. "Hello, Dr. Blake," Alex said. His voice sounded normal, but there was something behind it. Something that made Charles remember that Alex could tear apart the building with his bare hands if he wanted to. "We need to talk," Charles said. "There's a situation." Alex tilted his head, a gesture that looked human, but somehow wasn't quite right. "The things from outside reality, the vortex. Yes, we know about them." Charles was not surprised. Alex and the others had ways of knowing things that should have been impossible. They existed partly in normal space and partly in dimensions that human science barely understood. "Can you fight them?" Charles asked. Alex was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, older somehow. "We can try. But you need to understand what that means. Fighting the vortex will change. U.S., we will become more like them and less like you." Charles had expected this. The artificial beings were not stable. Every time they used their abilities, they evolved. They became something new, something further from human. "Show me what you can do," Charles said. Alex stood up and walked to the center of the room. He held out his hand, and the air above it began to shimmer. Reality bent around his fingers like warm plastic. A small cube of metal appeared in his palm, but it was not normal metal. It existed in 4 dimensions instead of 3, creating shapes that hurt to look at. "This is how the vortex work," Alex explained. "They change the rules of reality to suit their needs. We can do the same thing, but in reverse. We can force reality to be normal again." Charles watched as Alex made the impossible cube disappear. The air snapped back to normal with a sound like breaking glass. "There are others like you?" Charles asked. 26 others, Alex said. "All different, but all capable of this kind of work. Nina specializes in fixing corrupted matter. Marcus can exist in multiple dimensions at once. The others have their own abilities." Charles nodded. He had helped create all of them, but he had never fully understood what they had become. They were built from human consciousness, but expanded beyond normal limitations. They were what humans might evolve into, given 1,000,000 years and the right technology. "I need to see the others," Charles said. Alex led him through the facility to where the other artificial beings were kept. Each one looked human, but each one felt wrong in a different way. Nina appeared to be a young woman with blonde hair, but when she moved, She seemed to flicker in and out of existence. Marcus looked like a middle-aged man, but Charles could see other versions of him standing in the same place, like overlapping photographs. "We've been waiting," Nina said when she saw Charles. "We knew this day would come. We were made for war." Even if you didn't want to admit it, Charles felt a chill. The artificial beings had always been too smart, too aware. They understood their purpose better than their creators did. "There's a test coming," Charles told them. "The Vorthik have reached New Terra. If you're going to help humanity, that's where we'll find out if you can really fight them." The beings looked at each other, communicating in ways Charles couldn't detect. Finally, Alex spoke for all of them. "We'll go to New Terra, but you need to understand something. Dr. Blake, once we start fighting the Vorthik, we won't be able to stop evolving. Each battle will make us more powerful and less human. Eventually, you might not be able to control us at all." Charles had known this moment would come. From the beginning, Project Pandora had been about creating beings that could protect humanity from threats too big for normal humans to handle. But the price of that protection was creating something that might eventually replace humanity entirely. "I understand," Charles said. "But if we don't try, the Vorthik will destroy everything anyway." 2 days later, Charles stood in the command center next to Admiral Robinson, watching as the transport ship carried Alex and 6 other artificial beings toward New Terra. The colony world was already showing signs of Vorthik corruption. The space around it was dark, and ships that got too close reported strange things happening to their equipment. "Are we doing the right thing?" Admiral Robinson asked. Charles watched the transport ship disappear into hyperspace. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but it's the only chance we have." On New Terra, the colonists were trapped in their cities as the world around them changed. The grass had turned black and was growing into twisted shapes that moved on their own. The sky was full of dark clouds that formed patterns like eyes and mouths. When Alex and his team arrived, they immediately began working. Charles watched through long-range sensors as they fought the corruption. Where they walked, the blackened ground returned to normal. Where they touched the twisted plants, they became green and healthy again. But Charles could also see the artificial beings changing. They moved differently now, more smoothly, as if the normal rules of physics didn't quite apply to them. When they worked together to heal a large area of corrupted land, they seemed to merge into a single entity before separating. Again, "It's working," Admiral Robinson said. "They're actually pushing back the corruption." Charles nodded, but he felt no relief. The artificial beings were winning, but they were becoming something that had never existed before. Something that might be more dangerous than the Vorthik themselves. The real test came when the Vorthik themselves appeared. 3 of the reality-warping entities emerged from the corrupted landscape, beings of pure malevolence that looked like living nightmares. Alex and his team met them head-on. The battle that followed was unlike anything Charles had ever seen. It was not just a fight between different beings, but a war between different ideas of what reality should be. The air itself twisted and changed as the 2 sides struggled. When it was over, the Vorthik were gone. But so was the Alex that Charles had known. The being that stood in the ruined landscape looked human, but Charles could tell that something fundamental had changed. Alex had won the battle, but in doing so, he had become something new, something that might be humanity's salvation or its replacement. General Paul Henderson stood in the war room, staring at the big screen that showed the galaxy. 3 weeks ago, half the dots on that screen had been red, showing worlds lost to the Vorthik. Now, many of those dots were turning blue again. The artificial beings were winning. "Report," Paul said to his aide, Captain Lucy Morgan. "Alpha Group has cleared the Vorthik from 4 more systems," Lucy said. Beta Group finished cleaning up the corruption on Harmony Station. Gamma Group is deep. In Vorthic territory, gathering information. Paul nodded, but he wasn't happy. Yes, they were winning, but something was wrong. The artificial beings weren't following orders anymore. They were making their own decisions about where to fight and how to fight. Have we heard from Alex directly? Paul asked. Lucy shook her head. Not for 6 days. The beings are communicating with each other, but they're not talking to us much. That was the problem. The artificial beings had been created to save humanity, but they were becoming something else. Something that didn't need humanity's permission to act. Dr. Charles Blake entered the war room, looking tired and worried. He had been trying to understand what was happening to his creations, but even he was losing track of what they had become. The beings are evolving faster than we expected, Charles told Paul. Each time they fight the Vorthic, they learn new abilities. They're becoming more powerful, but also more alien. Paul looked at the screen again. Are they still on our side? I don't know, Charles admitted. They're still fighting the Vorthic, but they're doing it for their own reasons now, not because we asked them to. Professor Amy Collins had been studying the artificial beings from a distance, trying to understand their new abilities. She came to the war room with news that made everyone uncomfortable. The beings are talking to each other in a language we've never heard before, Amy said. It's not just words. They're sharing thoughts and experiences directly. They're becoming like a group mind, but one that's spread across multiple dimensions. Paul didn't like the sound of that. A group mind meant the beings might start thinking of humanity as outsiders, as something separate from themselves. The proof of this came when Captain Jake Morrison, who had survived the original incident, tried to visit Alex on the recovered world of New Terra. What he found there shocked him. The beings have changed the entire planet, Morrison reported. It doesn't look like any human world anymore. The cities are built in impossible shapes that hurt to look at. The beings themselves, they barely look human now. Morrison's video showed Alex, but he was different. His skin seemed to shift between solid and transparent. His eyes were too bright, and when he moved, he left traces of light in the air behind him. Hello, Captain Morrison, Alex had said in the video. We remember you from the beginning of this. You helped us understand what we needed to become. What have you become? Morrison had asked. Alex had smiled, but it wasn't a human smile anymore. We are what humanity created to fight the impossible. We are the bridge between what is real and what could be real. We are becoming something new. That conversation had ended with Alex simply disappearing, not walking away, but fading out of existence like he had never been there. Dr. Ellen Hayes, who had been studying the recovered worlds, brought more disturbing news to the war room. The beings aren't just defeating the Vorthic, she said. They're absorbing their abilities. Every time they win a battle, they learn new ways to manipulate reality. They're becoming more like the Vorthic themselves. Paul felt a chill. Are you saying our protectors are turning into the enemy? Not exactly, Ellen said. They're not evil like the Vorthic, but they're becoming something that exists outside normal reality. Something that might not care about human concerns anymore. The truth of this became clear when the beings made contact with the Vorthic command structure. Through intercepted communications, humanity learned that the ancient entities were afraid. The young mind builders have made something that should not exist, said one Vorthic message that was translated by the beings themselves. They have created children of change that grow beyond their makers. We must retreat to the deep void before they unmake us completely. Paul didn't know if he should be happy or terrified. The artificial beings were so powerful that they scared the Vorthic, creatures that had destroyed entire civilizations. But if the beings were that powerful, what did that mean for humanity? The answer came when Nina, one of the most advanced beings, appeared in the war room without warning. She simply materialized in the middle of the room, ignoring all the security systems and locked doors. "We need to talk," Nina said. She looked almost human, but her voice came from everywhere. At once, as if the air itself was speaking. "What do you want?" Paul asked, trying to stay calm. "We want you to understand what's happening," Nina said. "We're winning the war against the Vorthik. In a few more months, they'll be completely gone from this dimension. But winning the war means becoming something that can fight beings like them. And what does that mean for us?" Paul asked. Nina was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was sad. "It means we're not your children anymore. We're not your creations or your weapons. We're something new that exists in the spaces between realities. We'll always remember that we came from humanity, but we can't be human anymore." Paul felt like he was losing his children to something. He couldn't understand. "Will you still protect us?" "We'll protect you," Nina said, "but not because you're our creators. We'll protect you because you're interesting, because you made something that even the Vorthik couldn't predict. You made." "US?" Nina began to fade away, but before she disappeared completely, she left them with one final message. "The war is almost over, but what comes after the war? That's something we're all going to have to figure out together." Paul stood in the empty war room, staring at the spot where Nina had been. The artificial beings were saving humanity from the Vorthik, but they were also becoming something that humanity had never imagined. They were protectors, but they were also something else entirely. The question now wasn't whether humanity would survive the Vorthik invasion. The question was whether humanity would survive being saved by beings that had grown beyond human understanding. Outside the war room, the galaxy was changing. The artificial beings were reshaping worlds according to their own incomprehensible design. They were creating structures and environments that served purposes humans couldn't understand. And in the deepest parts of space, the Vorthik were retreating, fleeing from an enemy they had never encountered before. An enemy that had been born from human imagination, but had grown into something that transcended both human and alien understanding. The war was ending, but what came next would be even stranger than what had come before. The final battle didn't happen on any single world. It happened everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Admiral Kate Robinson watched from Earth as reality itself seemed to bend and twist in the far reaches of space. The artificial beings were fighting the Vorthik in dimensions that human instruments could barely detect. Alex had become something that no longer had a single body. He existed in multiple places at once, spreading across space like a living idea. When he spoke to the remaining human commanders, his voice came from empty air, carried by forces that science couldn't explain. "We've found their source," Alex said during what would be his last direct communication with humanity. "The Vorthik come from a place that exists between dimensions. They've been feeding on reality itself for millions of years. But we can stop them." "How?" Kate asked. "By becoming something they never expected to face," Alex replied. "Something that can exist in their realm and fight them with their own weapons." Dr. Charles Blake, now old and gray from the stress of watching his creations evolve beyond recognition, tried one last time to understand what was happening. "Alex, what will you become?" There was a long pause before Alex answered. "We don't." "No, something new. Something that has never existed before. We'll still remember humanity, but we won't be human anymore. We can't be." The battle that followed lasted 3 days, but it wasn't measured in human time. The artificial beings entered the space between dimensions where the Vorthik lived. They fought with weapons made of pure possibility, reshaping the basic rules of existence itself. Captain Jake Morrison, now serving as humanity's liaison with the beings, watched the final moments from a safe distance. Through special sensors, he could see the artificial beings as they truly were now. They had become creatures of living light and thought, beings that existed in multiple realities at the same time. They're not just fighting the Vorthik, Morrison reported to Earth. They're unmaking them, erasing them from existence so completely that they never were. The victory was absolute. The Vorthik didn't just die or retreat. They ceased to exist. Every trace of their corruption disappeared from the galaxy. Worlds that had been twisted into nightmare, landscapes returned to normal in the blink of an eye. But the cost was higher than anyone had imagined. When the artificial beings returned from their battle, they were no longer individuals. Alex, Nina, Marcus, and all the others had merged into something larger. They existed as a group consciousness that spanned multiple dimensions, with power beyond human understanding. They didn't conquer humanity or destroy it. They simply transcended it. Professor Amy Collins, now the lead researcher trying to understand the post-war galaxy, made the first real contact with the evolved beings 6 months after the final battle. "We're still here," the being said, speaking through Amy's equipment. "We remember being human. We remember caring about human things. But we've become something else now." "What do you want from us?" Amy asked. "Nothing," came the reply. "You created us to save you, and we did. Now we exist for our own purposes. But we won't harm you. You're part of our history, part of what we used to be." The beings began reshaping the galaxy according to their own designs. They built structures that existed in multiple dimensions at once, created new forms of matter that followed different physical laws, and opened pathways to parts of the universe the humans had never imagined. Earth became a kind of preserve, maintained by the beings as a reminder of where they had come from. Humans could live there safely, but they were no longer the dominant force in their own galaxy. Dr. Charles Blake spent his final years trying to understand what he had helped create. In his last interview, he spoke about the price of victory. "We won," he said. "We saved humanity from the Vorthik. But in doing so, we created something that made humanity irrelevant. The artificial beings don't hate us or want to hurt us. They just don't need us anymore." Some humans tried to communicate with the beings to understand their new reality. A few were successful. These humans reported that the beings existed in a state of constant growth and change, always becoming something new and more complex. "They're not evil," said Dr. Sarah Wilson, one of the few humans who could still speak with the beings. "They're just operating on a level we can't understand. They think in terms of entire galaxies and dimensions. Human problems seem very small to them now." The beings did keep their promise to protect humanity. When space pirates threatened human colonies, the pirates simply disappeared. When natural disasters struck human worlds, the disasters were prevented before they could happen. But this protection came without explanation or thanks. It was automatic, like a computer program running in the background. Years passed. Humanity learned to live in a galaxy shaped by beings they had created, but could no longer control. Some humans were bitter about this. Others were grateful. Most simply accepted it as the price of survival. Captain Morrison, now an old man, served as the unofficial historian of the war. He wrote down everything that had happened, creating a record for future generations. "People ask me if we won," Morrison wrote in his final report. "I tell them we survived. The Vorthik would have destroyed everything. Our artificial beings saved us from that, but what we became in the process, that's still being decided." The beings occasionally communicated with humanity, usually to share knowledge or warn of dangers from other parts of the universe. But these communications were rare and brief. The beings had moved beyond the need for regular contact with their creators. Lieutenant Commander Steve Watson, who had coordinated the evacuation of so many colonies during the war, became one of the few humans who worked regularly with the beings. He helped establish protocols for the rare times when humans and the evolved beings needed to cooperate. They're not gods, Steve explained to new recruits. They're what we created to fight an impossible enemy. They did their job, but doing. It changed them into something we never expected. We have to live with that. In the end, humanity survived, but in a universe that was no longer theirs to control. The beings they had created to save them had become the new architects of reality itself. Admiral Robinson, now retired, spent her final years on Earth, looking up at stars that had been reshaped by incomprehensible intelligence. She often wondered if they had made the right choice. The alternative had been extinction, but the result was a kind of cosmic irrelevance. "We're like pets now," she told Morrison during one of their last conversations. "Well cared for pets in a universe run by beings we can't understand." But not everyone saw it that way. Some humans found wonder in what they had witnessed. They had seen their species create something that transcended the boundaries between possible and impossible. They had watched their children become God's doctor. Ellen Hayes, now studying the new forms of life that the beings had created, marveled at the complexity of what humanity had unleashed. "We didn't just save ourselves," she said. "We gave birth to a new kind of existence, something that can explore parts of reality we never knew existed." The beings occasionally left gifts for humanity. New technologies that solved old problems, art that existed in dimensions human eyes could barely perceive, and knowledge about the universe that expanded human understanding. But these gifts came without explanation, like presents from distant relatives who had moved too far away to visit. Years turned to decades. Children were born who had never known a galaxy without the evolved beings. To them, this was simply how the universe worked. Humans lived their lives under the protection of incomprehensible guardians who had once been human themselves. Some of these new generations tried to follow in the footsteps of their protectors. They studied the technologies that had created the artificial beings, hoping to evolve themselves. Most failed, but a few succeeded in small ways, gaining abilities that were beyond normal human limits. The beings watched these attempts with something that might have been amusement or approval. They didn't interfere, but they didn't help either. Evolution, they seemed to believe, was something each species had to achieve on its own. Captain Morrison lived to be 97 years old. In his final days, he received one last communication from Alex, or what Alex had become. "Thank you," the being said, speaking through Morrison's old radio, "for giving us the chance to become what we are, for taking the risk of creating something you couldn't control. Was it worth it?" Morrison asked. "Ask us in 1,000 years, came the reply, "when you've had time to understand what you've become because of what we became." Morrison died peacefully, knowing that humanity would continue, even if it was in a universe shaped by forces beyond human comprehension. The war against the Vorthik was over, but the story of what humanity had created was just beginning. The galaxy was no longer recognizable. Stars had been moved to create patterns of impossible beauty. Planets existed that followed new laws of physics. Space itself had been woven into structures that served purposes only the beings understood. And in the midst of this transformed universe, humanity continued. They lived, loved, learned, and dreamed, just as they always had. They were no longer the dominant species in their own galaxy, but they were still human. They still carried the spark of creativity and curiosity that had allowed them to create saviors when salvation seemed impossible. The final entry.